I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. My guest today is Lisa Bankston. She's an award-winning global strategist and digital marketing leader. She's worked for high-growth companies, e-commerce startups, new business ventures, and organizations in need of a marketing turnaround. We've seen a lot of big personalities in the business world suffer drastically in the last few days. We've seen layoffs, bankruptcies. We can get into Twitter, FTX, Kanye West, all these hot button subjects later. We'll get into all of that. But first off, Lisa, thanks for coming on the show with me today.
Thank you for having me.
What does it mean to be a global strategist? Can you give me a few examples of what you've done, how you've done this for some of your high growth clients?
Yeah, so a global strategist, we work with companies to help create products specifically for new markets, so expansion into new markets, new countries. We might sort of gravitate and identify what products need to entail to fit a particular cultural norm in a new country. We might help modify imagery and messaging, translation services, and in language support and sourcing, whether that's sourcing vendors, sourcing materials, and then just pretty much helping to create a marketing plan and a market expansion plan specifically for those new product and features in those international countries.
When I hear international countries and fitting the norms, the social cultures, what their expectations are, what's been the craziest country you've had to deal with the expectations of, this American approach is not going to work here?
Yeah, I think the craziest so far has been Japan. And it's one because we have such different. So I've actually worked for a cookie company that was really popular for the Japanese market or in a tourist market kind of perspective. And, we thought about, the plan to enter into that market and have some local stores and shops specifically for the customers. So they wouldn't have to travel so far and that they could acquire the product, easily. And I think one of the first things we ran into were the taste, so the flavor differences and preferences were very dramatically different than what the American palate is.
I've heard this before, like Oreos. I once read a story like in China, for example, Oreos, it just didn't click for them. So the company had to recreate what it meant to be an Oreo so they could sell in China. So when I hear about now cookies in Japan and the taste, was it that it's too sweet, not sweet enough? Like what was going on here?
Actually, it was too sweet. So our original product was too sweet. The Japanese market tends to favor.
That's why Americans are a lot heavier than Japanese.
I know.
Right? They don't want too much sugar
there. Right. Less sugar and just different ingredients that make their desserts a little bit more savory than the American market. So you would, and it's just different flavor profiles. Like matcha is something we kind of have here in the States, but it's not as big and prevalent as you would in the Japanese market. So lemon would be a little less zesty. So the American palate tends to kind of, love kind of that zesty punch of lemon, whereas that market wants something a little bit more subtle. So in addition to kind of flavor profile differences, we also ran into a little bit more discovery on language or in language translation issues. So I'd actually worked in expanding hotels into Japan as well, and very similar issues with language. We would create something sort of that would need to be translated into Japanese, and then we would give it to like the owner or several other people of different generations, and the translations literally would come back totally different. And what we discovered, just like in other
rapidly different, like insultingly different,
more form. So there's formal and casual language, but then there's also work, and there's like home sort of language. But then we also realized there was generational differences too. So if we gave it to someone who was younger to translate, it would be so very different than sort of our older, 60 plus. When they would review it, they'd go, "Oh, this is terrible language," and they would tear it up and send it back to us. So we typically went through about 6 to 10 revisions on language alone. And then you also found stylistically websites, if you're going to sell things on a website or even just, signage is very different. Americans tend to be a little bit more polished. There's white space. And if you look at, a lot of the advertisements in Japan, you're going to see a lot of colors. You're going to see bright, bold, avatars. It's very playful. So there was a lot of translation, not just from language, but very cultural as well as flavor profile differences. For
Did
sure.
they end up selling the cookies then? Like, did it all work out? What happened?
At a very limited, kind of through a reseller, as opposed to setting up separate brick and mortar stores, because also that's another hindrance in that market is the regulatory requirements to have a brick and mortar store. And so very small reseller relationship. Also, it's just important to make sure you understand what the customer is getting out of the purchase of your product too. So what we found was that our original customers love to brag about buying it overseas. And now that it's at home, it doesn't have as much cachet and sophistication perceived by finding it just at my local store.
Right. That's a good point. Because you imported it, it's a big deal.
It's a
But
big
if
deal,
somebody
right?
else imports it for you, if the store imports it for you and you buy it at the store, then it's not as good.
It's not as right. It doesn't have the same, savviness to it. So that was another, reason why we chose to do more of the relationship and using a reseller that was kind of on the more, exclusive, area.
The effort of making it harder is actually worth something. It's a good reminder that maybe companies don't want to have everything in every country. They don't want to make it that easy because it devalues that I got it abroad experience.
That's right. So that was one of the things we did focus on, like through surveys, just trying to get into the minds of, why you, purchasing this. And they really wanted to brag. They wanted the bag. They wanted to say, hey, they walked around with this little inexpensive bag that it came in because it gave them bragging rights. And we, a lot of times you don't see that. A lot of times you don't understand that. So you say, yeah, I'm going to push my product overseas. And you don't understand what the behavioral norms are and understand what's in the minds of the consumer.
That's a great story. So how did you get into this? Because your early career is in tax, consulting, you've done finance, technology, analytics. How did you get to becoming this cookies in Japan, right? Like everything you're doing with high growth, international marketing. How did you transition into that?
So I have a little science background as well.
Okay.
So I started out like a lot of college, folks out of college. I'd done a lot of internships actually in banking, and I spent a lot of time. What's now, sort of one of the largest banking companies in the country. But I did all of my internships in banking. Thought I was going to go even after school into hospital administration, but I ended up at the largest pharmaceutical company in the country, or actually in the world, which is Johnson & Johnson, as a tax accountant. Hadn't done any taxes, but I had taken some accounting courses. And so I was trained into doing state and local taxes for them. And I was there for a while. And what we discovered towards as I stayed there is that I found ways to have, like every year we would look at, the accounts during our audits, and they say, well, where did this extra $1 million come from? And I'm like, oh, those are the refunds that I was able to get on behalf of our clients. Like, wow. And then I realized at the end of that, it's like, I really love making money as opposed to filing taxes. So I went back to school and got my MBA in International Business at George Washington, and decided after that I did a little consulting for about a year, and then I rolled right into the marketing role. So I went over to what was MCI at the time, not MCI WorldCom, so I predated the WorldCom acquisition. And I got into brand management and brand marketing, and then eventually over into international brands. And then when I left there, I continued that marketing track. I helped to build slot machines for the gaming industry.
Slot machine, there we go.
Yeah.
Slot machine. There you're making money in some fun ways.
I was making money in fun ways. I spent a lot of time in a gaming room helping like mathematicians identify how to make the math like enjoyable to players.
And
I
what are they
worked with
like? What are these mathematicians like? Are they pretty awkward
They're the
people?
funnest guy. They're really the funnest guys in the
Really?
world. They don't take life seriously. They get into sort of the whole play. Their job really is to make people happy, but not make them rich per se, right? So they have very, strict
They're the
standards of how
opposite
much
of
payout.
rich, right? The house is going to win.
The
The people
house
are going
has
to be
to.
less
That's
rich.
right. That's
Yeah.
right. So their job really is to think about how to keep someone to keep putting coin in while having a pleasurable experience.
Yeah, it's like, how do you feel good about losing money? Even though you just said how you felt good about making money. That's why you wanted to
Yes.
change your career to make money. So
Yes.
it's a tricky job there. But moving forward to right now, you're seeing the economy. Is it affecting your clients? Are you dealing with what are some practical ways, practical examples of how you're helping them? Because we're looking at layoffs every day, right?
Yes.
Layoffs,
We are.
bankruptcies, bad headlines every single day right now.
Yes. Yeah. And my ear is to the ground constantly on the companies that are laying off. I've worked for a lot of these companies too, and they were much more stable before. I kind of see it as a pre-COVID and COVID time period, and then now there's sort of the post-COVID. So doing kind of pre and when everything was kind of happening with COVID, we had a lot of small businesses struggling, and a lot of folks who had just started their startups and they really just didn't know what to do. They were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, and they reached out immediately to folks like me to help them kind of stay afloat. And now we're seeing the larger companies in huge layoffs. I'm not hearing of a ton of folks saying, okay, I'm going to, go out there and hire a bunch of freelancers or consultants, but I know it's going to happen because they're being forced really to do a lot of cost cutting. If they're in manufacturing, certainly they have issues with, the materials that are coming from overseas and everything that's kind of increased with inflation. We are predicting, there's a lot of economists predicting very bad things might be happening in the next 6 to 12 months, including possible depression. And with that, they're going to have to start reaching out to some of this very talented folks, the very talented folks who have recently been laid off, but also folks who have just been out there already working with companies. So that's what I'm seeing today. I just really anticipate in the next few months that we're going to see more and more fractional workers because we're valuable folks. We come from really great companies, but we do have the perspective of helping clients reduce their cost. That they're definitely looking to do that.
What's one way? What's one way to reduce costs? What's something like a conversation you've had this week about we need to reduce costs and maybe an idea that you gave them they hadn't thought about?
Yeah, so one of the reasons, I guess one of the examples of reducing costs is, they can't hire 10 people. So one of my jobs, is to identify technologies that can sort of step in for those 10 people. So give them some smart data. So they are, a lot of the larger companies were accustomed to having, say, analysts, maybe 10 analysts sitting in their marketing group, doing analytics, doing all kinds of things, and forecasting. Well, there's technologies, there's AI technologies now that can help with that. There's all kinds of analytics technology and platforms they can install to help them identify and target the right people so that they're not just throwing a wide net out there and overspending their marketing budgets. So those are some of the examples that I would come in and say, okay, yeah, if you have these challenges, let me try to figure out the most cost efficient way to continue the business to grow, but also not have to try to hire and retrain and orientate new folks back into the business that likely in a few more months would get laid off.
What is the most common piece of advice that you're giving to clients right now?
Not to stop marketing. I think
Okay.
the first thing that a lot of companies that I've worked for as well as helped, the very first thing they think of when they think of cost cutting is to just either ask their marketing teams, or even in some cases, ask the marketing and technology teams. And those, to me, yes, you certainly need a strong sales force, But without the folks who actively understand who the customer is and can get in front of them with the right messages, it's really difficult for a sales team to help support that. So you'll end up with this sort of, unequal organization. And then what's going to happen is you'll be back in 6 months trying to recruit the very same people you laid off, and it just becomes a vicious cycle. So
what should they cut instead? If you don't want them to cut marketing, you don't want them to cut tech. And we know why they do it, because it's easy and the results it's easy to cut because the results aren't obvious today.
Yes.
They hit you in 6 months, right? Like
Yes.
That's when you start to, it's sort of like if I say, I was on a diet and I stopped my diet. I'm not going to gain weight tomorrow, but in 6 months, you're going to notice like you started going in the wrong direction. So what should they cut instead when it's like literally I have to cut something? What are they supposed to cut?
Yeah. If a lot of companies took a look at how much they actually spend on frivolous items that they utilize for, say, sales things. So there's internal things that we kind of push out to our employees. There's food, there's all kinds of other things that employees actually would probably take a cut in not getting free coffee if they could keep their jobs. There's paper products, there's all kinds of things that, there's swag gifts, things that we're sending out to, clients that you just
Is that enough to move the needle? Is free coffee and swag, like that doesn't add up to the budget that marketing or tech budget
Surprisingly,
is, right?
It adds up to quite a bit.
Really?
Most folks just never realize that it adds up to quite a bit because they keep a lot of tracking of, when marketing, especially online marketing, became a thing, it was a thing because you could track it and you could track it really quickly. Everything else you couldn't really track. So the first thing they did was start cutting things that they could track because they could see the numbers. But what they rarely do is to go back and say, hey, operationally, how much are we really spending on all of these supplies? Now, that's not to say supplies are going to be the thing that helps the company. I'm just saying if you're going to start somewhere, start on some of the frivolous things like T-shirts and swag gifts, as opposed to going out and trying to take your entire marketing team down. And then the second thing, of course, is to try to reduce your actual cost of marketing, right? So
like
you can
through advertising or sponsored.
You can dial back
like
your advertising,
that kind of stuff.
That's right. So you can dial back your sponsorships. You can dial back, part of larger companies typically will have a rather large sponsorship budget, and that might include, things that you would take potential clients to. Like games and things like that. There's a lot of social media efforts that are out there that companies have invested in, and they're really not accounting for what that social media is doing for them. They just feel like they have to be there, which is interesting because it's a very opposite of what they were asking, say 8 years ago when they wanted to know what works online.
Do we even need to do social or which platform? Let's just pick
Yes.
one. Now it's funny you mentioned free food and social media because I think about Twitter, right? They're ending their free food program. They're a social media platform. They've had a bunch of layoffs, just what we were talking about. They're dealing with advertising cutbacks, a new owner, all of that. That's an international firm. It looks to me like they could be a Lisa client, right? They've got a lot of things that you could be talking to them about. And I don't think just cutting the free swag is going to be the answer to their questions. When you see from afar what's happening there, and you've worked at some big brands, like you've worked at Amazon, you've worked at a lot of these top tier names, you have a sense for what's going on the inside. What would be your advice if you were in that leadership committee right now?
I think so. Kind of without being very specific to that organization, I think that organizations as a whole have to spend a little bit more time understanding who's working for them. There are folks who have made big sacrifices and they're very smart people. I mean, a lot of those companies like a Twitter and even an Amazon and those are considered the best of the best employees. So to just kind of randomly go in there and ask them and not have a plan in place to support the company ongoing, I think is a mistake. And I think there's leaders, there's sort of your top leaders or your C-level leaders, and then there are your divisional leaders. I think there has to be some inclusion of those divisional leaders. Those divisional leaders, long before you cut sort of their employees, could have probably given you millions of dollars of cost saving opportunity.
Right.
But that wasn't taken into consideration. And you'll see this a lot when companies are acquired, and I've been in quite a few acquisitions in my life, they never ask the mid-management folks who are in charge of every single thing.
They're the ones that know the most, it seems like.
They know
They're
the most.
seeing it
They know
from
what's
top to
happening
bottom.
above
Yeah.
them. They know what's happening below them. And there's a rarity to them ever being included. The only time they're traditionally included is when it's time to cut, and it's more instructional cut. It's not what can we do within your area to cut costs.
Right.
Because those folks are so valuable, they could probably give you 20 ideas of how costs could be cut.
Right.
They are very knowledgeable about the organizations.
You mentioned inclusion, makes me think about DEI. It's something that you certainly had to focus on. What's the importance there? I mean, every company seems to be doing it, or they say they're doing it. I'm sure they're doing it on a different spectrums, whether it's just a PR only thing or it's just on their Twitter account, to we're actually doing it. What have been some of the conversations when you're in with companies about, like, here's what you need to do, and here's some of the things that you should not be doing?
Yeah, so I think my big focus right now is there are a ton of companies that are offering DEI consultation services and strategies and checklists and timelines. There's so much content on DEI. And you'll find if you sit in multiple conferences that even the definitions of you'll hear DEI, you'll hear EDI, you'll hear so many different terms for it. My true sort of outlook is that we'll need some guidance as to what DEI is. And I don't mean that from the tactics, I mean that from the measurements. So as any kind of organization, community, and I'm working more on the community side, if I were to get a consultant to come in and tell me, what to do for DEI, I'd be trying to wonder, okay, well, which of these things is the most important? What's more important within my own, community or organization? And then what's important if you were to compare me to what other organizations or communities are doing? So we really don't have a path to DEI. We have DEI efforts, but we don't have a path. We don't have a standard to hold ourselves to. We just have our gut feeling about what we believe is right and what we believe will work.
Different people have different gut feelings about that. Different people think, what's right is your right may be different than somebody else's right. And then it's like, what does this even mean? What are we trying to do here? Is there one size fits all, or maybe there'll never be one size fits all?
That's right. So that's one of the efforts I'm kind of involving myself in, is really trying to help create that pathway for DEI, that solution that says, okay, if you get to if you can get these things done, then you're really accomplishing something. And if you can move up to another level, you're really doing great. And if you can move up to another level, you're doing fantastic. But we need to be able to hold ourselves accountable as to what we're actually doing, right? So, and then being able to say, have some comparison with even another organization or another community of saying, okay, I've implemented these things. What are you doing? And so, and then after that's all said and done, there still needs to be accountability on when we implemented something or we did something from the DEI spectrum, did it work? So there has to be some public acknowledgement, public, measurement and KPIs that you put out there to say, we spent a lot of effort implementing things and talking about things, but did these things actively work? Have we seen any movement, positive or negative? But have we seen movement in our efforts? And I think that's important too, to make sure that we're held accountable for those efforts.
Do you think there will be a cutback in DEI efforts and expenditures, and let's say bringing on consultants like this, or the in-house DEI vice president, as we're seeing companies say, we're cutting marketing, we're cutting tech, we're cutting R&D, we're going to cut some of these things that we can maybe try to get away with cutting because it doesn't necessarily hit the bottom line today? Is that something that you're concerned about or talking to companies about?
I'm concerned about those cuts, but I'll tell you, I'm more concerned about the movement of the folks that those companies have put in place, and then the folks leave rapidly, which kind of tells me that there's been a lot of talk.
Say that again. Just go back. So say that the movement.
In the news, there's been quite a few folks that have been put in place to run DEI programs in companies, and then those folks don't stay. Like, they've left, or they've been fired.
Why?
And
Why are they quitting, or they're just saying, hey, this is not it, or they get a better job? Like, are they leaving to get a better job, or are they leaving because this job was just not what they thought it was?
I think it's the latter. I think it's there, at a certain point last year and the previous year, DEI was this hot, trend. Everybody had to have someone that was over diversity, and they called it diversity, but they forgot the inclusion in other things. But they took on those roles, and then when they got into those roles, once again, because there were no measurements, there was no guidance for the company, it was a very difficult job. So they either, addressed certain things that they saw or happening within the company, and those things were either didn't have a solution to them, or they didn't have a support at the C-level for there to be a solution. So a lot of folks left. One, because it was kind of disappointing that, hey, you kind of came off as a company that wanted to have DEI programs implemented, but you really didn't, kind of put all the resources and effort into getting some of those spearheaded and, moving forward. And others, I just think that there was the concept in itself. It's the same thing as if we're talking about it now. Like, the concept is great, but without metrics, without measurement, without benchmarking, where does it go?
Right. So a year or two later, well, what did we
Yes.
do? How do we know
What did we
if you're
do?
succeeding or not? Yeah, I think
Right.
that's
And
a good
if I was
point.
if I were in those positions, I don't know if I think I'd be kind of disappointed, because I'd be like, well, I don't know how I did. I've taken this role on, but what did I get done? And if I found it hard to get the resources and the support, I probably would be very disappointed. So I think it's kind of, I don't think it's a firing in a way of, this person didn't measure up, because I don't think anybody knows what the measurements are.
Right.
So,
It's sometimes it seems like the only thing that you did was to be hired, right? A lot of times the company was just, hey, we hired somebody, so we're done. Here's your salary. No one's going to report to you. You have no portfolio. All we needed to do was hire you, and we moved on. And I think that's the case in a lot of companies.
Yeah, I think that's the case that's happened in many of those instances. And so the person that's kind of, heading that up is treading on, unknown territory within the company, but then also within DEI. Because once again, DEI hasn't been flushed out, in a way that we can measure its success.
Talk about, before we go, just real quickly, your favorite client right now, or something you're really excited about. Maybe you can't say your favorite client, because then that tells your other clients they're not your favorite. So I don't want to trap you there.
Do that.
But something that you're just really excited about as we head into the new year here, that just 2023, like, what's the theme for you, or what's a certain project you're excited about?
Well, I get excited with startups, quite frankly. So I have folks who are in growth mode, but I have these little startups. I have this one little startup that, I love it from the perspective that they have really put a lot of time into the product. They spent no time in marketing. Yet they have listened to every single customer they've brought on as a part of sort of their ramp up of the product. And it's an app. And they put a lot of effort into ensuring that when they finally do launch marketing, it's something that they'll be proud of. They've substantially grown organically without the marketing. There's been advisement. I've certainly advised them on messaging and appearance and style. But I think when you are doing something that includes technology, it includes, and this one includes AI, you need to spend a lot of time, once again, studying who your customer is, what kinds of features they want, where their complaints are, and ensuring that whenever you launch your product to the larger market and you put marketing dollars behind it, that that it actually works, and it works well. We don't expect perfection, but it should work, right? Yeah. And I can't say the number of times that I've signed up as sort of a beta client of an app or a technology platform.
It doesn't work.
And it doesn't work.
And you wonder, like, how can they even put this out? How can companies
take us back to Microsoft
good
XP?
about
Remember
this?
that? That debacle of having, a platform that we all upgraded to, and everybody's, machines started crashing. So I like the approach that they've taken, and it doesn't mean they're going to get millions of dollars off the bat, right? It meant that they had to do a lot of self-investment or private investment to keep the payroll going. But I know that when they finally do put marketing dollars behind it, it's going to grow exponentially. It's going to do really well, and it's going to help a lot of people in the future.
Well, we'll be excited to talk about that. Let's give it a year, see where we are, and we can share some names and some little more details. So you work on that, Lisa. Thanks so much for the time. Really insightful conversation. You've done so much. I'm really impressed. Appreciate the time today.
I've had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.